Our scripture reading for today is going to come out of the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be reading chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and I'm reading out of the NRSV today. This is what the scripture says. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out. And there, ahead of them, went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Beautiful passage of Scripture, and it's one that we use to launch off the season of Epiphany. Now, a lot of churches, you'll notice they celebrated Epiphany last week, and we'll talk about that. But today we celebrate the first Sunday of Epiphany, and many churches last week celebrated it, and that's because technically last week on Tuesday is when Epiphany was kicked off. And some chose to celebrate the beginning of Epiphany on the Sunday closest to that date. Some choose to celebrate it on the first Sunday after it. In this case, we are the latter. We are celebrating it on the first Sunday after it. Now, Epiphany comes from the Greek for manifestation, and in this context, we're acknowledging not necessarily the birth of Christ, right? Because that's what we were doing through Advent. We were anticipating, and that's what we did here on Christmas Eve, culminating on Christmas Day. We celebrated the birth. But Epiphany is the celebration of Jesus Christ being revealed as the Son of God to the whole world. And it's a beautiful time of year. And interestingly, there's a difference between Western Christianity's Epiphany and Eastern Christianity's Epiphany. I'll give you time to sleep. If anybody wants to sleep for the next 5 minutes, you can wake back up, and then we'll pick up with what you might like. But we'll talk about this for a little bit. It's kind of fun. When we talk about Western Christianity, you think Western, Eastern Christianity. I thought there was just Christianity. When we talk about Western Christianity, we're talking about traditions like the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of Protestant churches, Lutheran, Reformed, Methodist, Baptist, congregational churches just like ours. But Eastern Christianity primarily refers to Eastern Orthodox churches, which kind of developed in a different cultural and theological world and learned to emphasize different moments in the life of Jesus. In the Eastern Christian tradition, Epiphany is centered around the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan River, right? This is the moment when the heavens open up, the Spirit descends, and a voice from heaven declares, "This is my beloved Son." And so that, to them, is Jesus first being revealed to the world. That's how the Eastern Church celebrates it. It's the great unveiling, God publicly revealing who Jesus is. So Epiphany there, you'll notice it has a little bit of a different emphasis. It's about divine declaration. It's about God naming Jesus before the world. But in the Western Church, Epiphany is most often centered on the visit of the Magi. It's what we just read here. So what we just read, obviously, and what we're going to be focusing on today. And here, revelation, it doesn't come through a voice in heaven, but it comes through recognition on the ground. And themes that we begin to see, our outsiders are seeing these magi that are coming from a different location. They're not Jews. They're not residents of Israel. You might call them pagans. But they seem to be recognizing what insiders miss. The religious Jews, the people in power, the kings. We begin to see themes like power feeling threatened, but love responds by kneeling. And the focus isn't necessarily on God announcing Jesus' identity in this grandiose way, but the focus seems to be on who is able to recognize him when God shows up. Now, since we stand in the Western tradition this morning, we're listening to Epiphany through Matthew's story. And it is a beautiful one, a story that asks not just who Jesus is, but where we can find God and who is able to see God. And it's important that we understand authorial intent. See, I said 5 minutes, but I'm going to keep going on. It's going to be a little bit boring, unless you're really excited about this. Like me. So I'll try to make it as exciting as I can. But it's really important that we understand authorial intent when it comes to Matthew, when we're reading this passage, because the book of Matthew is really the only one that tells this really unique story of the Magi, believe it or not. You'd think it's this wonderful, grandiose story all the Gospels would tell. But Matthew is the only one that tells this really unique story. And if you're coming to our Messy Bible study, which I invite all of you to, it's open to all, and you don't have to have any prerequisite classes. It's a lot of fun. You could just show up and plug in. But if you were there last week, and you are in the group that's assigned to the Gospel of Matthew, I'm going to bleed over into that a little bit, so I apologize. Still read it. Still do your research. That's what Joe was hoping for, and it'll be a good time. Anyway, but in order for us to understand why, out of all the four Gospels, only Matthew has this story of the Magi coming to meet Jesus. And not only that, it's the only one that has the story of Herod's infanticide, or the mass killing of all the baby boys. It's the only story that has Jesus and his family fleeing to Egypt. It has the story of the visit from the Magi, and a bunch of other unique stories that we'll talk about. But this really elaborate early story of Jesus and these moving parts, Matthew's the only one that has it. And why only Matthew? Well, here's the nuance, and this is important to understanding our reading. Get ready for this. You guys, you got to gasp when I say this, okay? Firstly, the disciple Matthew likely didn't write the Gospel of Matthew. I know. I had the same reaction. Thank you for that. Wonderful participation. And this is largely a consensus among scholars, and that's okay, because from the beginning it was intended to be anonymous. From its inception, the Gospel of Matthew was intended to be anonymous. The writer, throughout this whole Gospel account, which we call Matthew, gives no indication of who he or she is. It's likely a he just because of the context, but we can add she because you never know. Sometimes things surprise us. But he gives no indication of who he or she is. And it was attributed to Matthew much later. Think about the 2nd century, and when Christianity started to become more organized and they started developing a canon of Scripture, they attributed it to Matthew, but there's little to no basis for that attribution. Everybody doing all right? We still awake? We're getting somewhere, I promise. We're going somewhere. Whoever wrote Matthew probably used Mark's gospel as the primary source. You think of Mark. Mark was written a good chunk before Matthew. And why do we know that? It's because Matthew has about a 90% similarity to the book of Mark. Meaning about 90% of Mark's gospel appears in Matthew. And not just that, it often appears word for word or in the exact same order. And sometimes whoever wrote Matthew will even improve on what Mark is writing stylistically. It's like, you know, he had to be a teacher. He was going through there with a red pen and kind of correcting stuff and improving stuff. Now, that's a bit of a basic explanation because there's more that we use to make that conclusion. But I'm trying to make sure that everyone can make it to the end of the sermon, so I'm not going to keep going with all that stuff. Okay, so there's a 90% carryover, you would say. What about the 10%? What a great question. You guys are asking great questions this morning. Well, some of it is carryover from the Gospel of Luke, or maybe it's a common source that both Luke and Matthew would have shared together. We speculatively call this source the Q source. The shared stories in Luke and Matthew are things like the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, teachings like ask and it will be given to you, seek and you'll find, love your enemies, etc. All those things. And all that's great. But then after we filtered through the Q source, the M source, which is Matthew, all these things, we're left with some really interesting stories that don't find themselves in any other Gospels. And those stories tell us exactly what the writer of Matthew most wants us to know. So Matthew was likely written around between 80 and 90 CE, or I remember from the Bible study on Wednesdays, I need to say AD. AD. For all intents and purposes, 80 to 90 AD, so roughly 50 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. And it's coming out of a Christian community trying to understand what Jesus' life meant in light of everything that has happened since his death, especially the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Huge thing. So, in this Epiphany story, what we see is the insiders. If you remember what we read, the Jews, the people on the inside, King Herod, panics and incites violence, right? Herod, the so-called king of the Jews, backed by political and religious authority, he responds with fear and brutality because he's insecure about his power. While the outsiders are the Magi, right? They're Gentiles that come from the east. They're religious foreigners. They're pagans. They're people that don't believe in Yahweh. They don't believe in God. People who stand completely outside of Israel's covenant and institutions. And yet, they are the ones in Matthew's story who recognize the revelation in the Epiphany story. They see what the powerful Jewish leaders are missing. And these Magi's, who are Gentiles, or Magi's, plural, these Magi who are Gentiles, they don't respond with control or certainty, but they respond with worship. When they recognize Jesus, they respond with worship, not with insecurity. So we ask, why is this emphasized in the Gospel of Matthew? Well, because that's what's happening real time when Matthew is being written. This is a reflection of the community. In the writer of Matthew's own community, there is a mixed Jewish-Gentile church. The city of Jerusalem has fell. The temple has been completely destroyed. This is the beginning of the diaspora. Jews from all over the place are running. They're fleeing. And they're mixing in with Gentiles. They're no longer primarily centered in Jerusalem. Jews, and so in these communities, Jews are watching Gentiles embrace Jesus, while many religious leaders and many devout Jews are not embracing Jesus. And as a quick note, this story was not written to deceive or manipulate. It was written by a devout follower of Jesus who told his story in the way that ancient faith communities told stories. It's how they communicated truth. They didn't use modern historical precision, but they told stories through sacred meaning, sacred storytelling. They weren't obsessed with scientific facts in the way that we are today. They were committed to conveying what they believed God had revealed through Jesus and what his mission meant for the world. The Gospel of Matthew is theology that is told as stories. So it's holy tradition that's shaping a narrative, and it proclaims who Jesus is, about how power responds to him, and where God is ultimately found. Why is that important? Epiphany for us, in our tradition, has everything to do with finding God in the most unlikely of places. Or more precisely, in the most unlikely of people. God's work revealed through a vulnerable child. Who would have thought? Recognized first, not by religious leaders, but by the Magi? By Gentiles? Who would have thought? These people that were outside of Israel's religious system, foreigners, people with no standing. These things, Jesus, God being revealed as a baby, first seen by Gentiles. This would have been deeply unsettling to the Jewish people. Deeply, deeply unsettling. And it was deeply unsettling from what we know about history. In Matthew's gospel, the people who proclaimed God most loudly, who knew the scriptures the best, who were the most confident in their religious certainty, they are very often the ones who miss what God is doing. And if you read through the Gospel of Matthew, that seems to be the theme over and over and over again. Meanwhile, also in the Gospel of Matthew, outsiders, they're always seeing, seemingly, what God is doing. They are responding to what God is doing, what Jesus is doing. They're moved to awe. They're moved to worship. And this pattern runs through Matthew over and over and over again. Gentiles are showing surprising faith. The poor and the marginalized recognize God's presence. And those invested in power and control struggle to see it all. Epiphany names this uncomfortable truth: that God is often revealed not where we would expect, but where we often least want to look. And Matthew keeps returning to it again and again and again. And in fact, that's how he kicks off Jesus' life. Get ready for this. Tensions are high in our world right now. And sometimes outrage is justified and sometimes it isn't. But I want to offer a word of caution this morning. It is easy to let fear and anger turn you into a weapon of justice. But it's so much harder to let empathy shape you into an instrument of healing. I spent a lot of time listening this week and the week prior. I've listened to my wife. I've watched the social and political scrambling. I've seen people that I love respond very differently to the same events, mainly my grandma on Facebook. That's a joke, you can laugh. And the truth is, after spending a couple months with you all and talking to various people, we are a church that is made up of people who see the world in very different ways. We vote differently, we interpret events differently, and when tensions rise, it becomes very easy to pick a side and just ride it out. That's the truth. But Epiphany is asking something harder of us. It asks us to slow down and to notice where God is actually being revealed. Because once we plug ourselves into the ideological hive mind that feeds off of our outrage and our certainty, it becomes very difficult to see clearly. Matthew's story reminds us that those that are often most confident, who thought that they were on the right side, were often the ones who missed God entirely because their vision shifted away from where God is and oftentimes trying to find the devil. It's subtle. You've got to be careful. The ones who saw clearly were the ones willing to kneel, to listen, to respond with humility, to respond with love, to respond with empathy rather than fear. When given the option, Jesus did not choose the right or the left. He didn't choose the Romans over the Jews. He didn't choose the Pharisees or the Sadducees. So what did Jesus choose? Because he did choose a side. Believe it or not, Jesus did choose a side. Who did he align himself with? The widow, the poor, the hungry, the sick, the immigrant, the brokenhearted. Not for a political reason, but because those are the people that often suffer the most, and they are usually the ones that are left unseen. And as I've sat with that the last week, it becomes clear to me that there is really a way to always be on the right side. You ready for this? I have all the answers. There is a way to always be on the right side. Not by picking the correct camp, but by always choosing compassion. If you always choose compassion, you never have to worry about being deceived. You never have to worry about upsetting the other side. You never have to worry about getting swept up in a culture war. By choosing compassion, by not defending power, but by kneeling in love. And Epiphany reminds us that God isn't revealed where certainty is the loudest, but where mercy is practiced. So if we want to follow the light, we don't start by asking who's right. We start by asking who is hurting. And then we go there, because that's the only bona fide way to know where God is. He's with the hurting, and the brokenhearted, and the victims. That's all I got. See, I did my best not to make a political statement. Hopefully you see that. But by encouraging everyone to offer compassion. And I know this isn't typically, and I hope everybody knows, what I'm talking. I feel like sometimes, you ever talk around your kids or your grandkids, and you really don't want them to know what you're talking about, and so you don't really talk in this code, and you don't really name it outright, but you try to communicate it in such a way where your spouse understands what that's kind of what I was doing right there. So I hope everybody understands kind of what I was talking about. And Epiphany was the perfect opportunity, I think, to understand what binds us all together. The compassion, the love. Like I said, that's all I got. Well, feel free to talk about it. We can all have our opinions. But the moment that we step out of love, the moment that we step out of compassion, is the moment that we fail to do exactly what Jesus is asking us to do. Will you stand with us? Will you sing as we reflect on these things